Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for that very warm introduction. I want to thank Mayor Suarez and Tom Cochran for putting this important event on. It is an incredible honor to be here with you today. I'm one of the newbies that are here. I've been a mayor for a total of 5 weeks. And I will tell you that I am excited to be here because just in the couple of days I have been here, there is so much experience in this room, and I look forward to learning from each and every one of you. Now, I will say being here in Washington is a bit of a homecoming for me, considering I finished in December my 6th term, 12 years in Washington, D.C., and it was a big decision to decide to leave. But needless to say, when I was watching the way the 118th Congress was sworn in, I think I was kind of happy I was leaving the Capitol and going to City Hall. But in all seriousness, the reason why I made this decision to leave Congress and to come back to Los Angeles is because Los Angeles is in the middle of a crisis, like many, many cities are, a crisis that I consider a humanitarian crisis, a crisis that I consider an absolute emergency. And in our city, the idea that we have 47,000 people who are unhoused, and that's just the city of Los Angeles. If I were adding the county, you have to add 20,000 more, so that's 67,000 people. And as many cities are struggling with tents and encampments all over the place, you can imagine how many tents and encampments that is. So the voters in Los Angeles tried a couple of times, taxed themselves twice. And in 2016, when the first tax was approved, there were 27,000 people on the streets. Now, after taxing ourselves twice, to have the population of unhoused metastasize to that extent, you can imagine that voters in Los Angeles were angry, discouraged, frustrated. They taxed themselves twice, and what they saw was the number of unhoused people explode. Broken down RVs started to line neighborhood streets. Makeshift structures and tents popped up on sidewalks, in parks, in front of schools, in front of businesses. And the problem, of course, when you have situations like that, is that Angelenos then began to feel unsafe. And we had an increase in crime, with 25% of the homicides in Los Angeles 2 years ago were of people that were unhoused. And some unhoused people were attacked. So as the mood in the city began to be very negative, and as the empathy quotient decreased, to me, I was very, very worried that with an increase in anger, a decrease in empathy, that what you can have, that is a recipe for very bad policies. And for me, it made me have flashbacks to the 1990s in Los Angeles when we faced another crisis at that time. That crisis, from my point of view, was a public health crisis. You remember the crisis of the cities in the 90s. It was crack cocaine. It was gang violence. Los Angeles was the epicenter of the Crips and the Bloods. In that one year, in 1990, we had 1,000 homicides. And so what happened then was you had fear, you had anger, and you had terrible policies. At the same time as people were passing policies that, in my opinion, amounted to criminalizing a public health crisis, we also saw what I would describe as an evisceration of our social safety net. If you put all of those together, along with some policies like welfare reform, when welfare reform really took effect during an economic downturn, you saw an increase of the unhoused population that then began to include women and children. We cut back on substance abuse. We never really built a mental health system, but cutting back and eviscerating substance abuse programs then led to the crisis in the 90s. And what I believe we did was we passed very bad policies. We began to criminalize and incarcerate people, and it was the beginning of a time period that people called mass incarceration. So when I reminded myself of that time period, reflecting back on that, I felt like what we were experiencing in Los Angeles, we were getting ready to repeat history. And I think overall we tend to be an ahistorical society, and when we don't repeat history and we don't learn from it, I believe that many of the decisions that were made during those years contributed to the problems that we face today. So many people being incarcerated. Now we're beginning to rethink criminal justice reform or criminal justice policies. A lot of people are being released, but we didn't think about what was going to happen to them when they became released. We had a 70% recidivism rate in California, but what has happened is California has downsized its prison population. They wind up being released into communities and wind up being unhoused. Those were the reasons that led me to decide to run, because of the crisis and because, as I said, I believe it is a humanitarian crisis. But this is an opportunity to learn from the past, to get people off the streets, but to also address why they were on the streets to begin with, and to acknowledge the diversity of the unhoused population, and not just the ethnic diversity, but the fact that the people who are on our streets are there for a variety of different reasons. We have veterans that are there. In Los Angeles, we have people who live in tents who actually work full-time. They just can't afford rent because it is so expensive to live in Los Angeles. Somebody might have had a credit problem. Somebody might have been evicted before, and they're not able to rent again. Those are some of the reasons why people end up unhoused. In Los Angeles, we have thousands of children that are unhoused, women fleeing domestic violence, people who are suffering from mental illness and substance abuse. So my concern is that with the recipe of an angry electorate, with people feeling like they actually tried by taxing themselves and nothing happened, that then is a recipe for people to say, you know what, let's just get rid of these people, just move them away. I will say that in Los Angeles, the other thing that has happened is that a lot of the homelessness now is citywide, and it's in areas that are very affluent too, that have absolutely no tolerance for this. People are to the point of saying, get them away, I don't care what happens to them. If you need to involve the police, that's fine, just get them out of my neighborhood. The problem with that is that you can arrest somebody, you can give them a ticket, but they're going to be out in a few days, right back on your street, and it doesn't solve the problem. So I ran for mayor after a very difficult, very expensive race. When I took office on December 12th, I said the first thing I was going to do was to declare a state of emergency. We declared a state of emergency, and people said, well, what does that mean? To me, it is a humanitarian crisis. I view it like a man-made disaster. And when you have an emergency, when you have a disaster, a natural disaster, you don't sit around and say, well, you know what? You need to prove to me that you've actually been homeless for 6 months. You need to have an ID in order for me to even provide any services for you. Well, if you've been living in a tent for 5 years, tell me how you're going to prove, 1, that you've been there for 6 months, or 2, that you have an ID. How about putting the person in a house, in an apartment, and then do the paperwork? So we declared a state of emergency. A couple of days later, I issued an executive directive that says we are going to fast forward building, because it's very difficult to get anything built in Los Angeles, all of the red tape. But again, if you have the frame that it is a disaster, it is an emergency, then you're not going to say, well, it's going to take me 8 months to do the inspection on your property. After we taxed ourselves, by the way, voters were appalled when they found out that to build 1 unit in an apartment building, it had cost close to $700,000. And the reason for that is because it took so darn long. And so how can we expedite building? So we did that executive directive, and I will tell you that the press conference that I had was at a property where they had been trying to break ground for 14 years and weren't able to do that. So the other thing that we did is we launched a program called Inside Safe, because my point of view is that what we have to do is we have to get people out of these tents. The fact that our society has reached a point where we accept people living on the street and living anywhere, it's like, what has happened to us? It is completely unacceptable. And so Inside Safe is a program that does not just move people away, certainly doesn't ticket them, but we send outreach workers, people who were formerly unhoused themselves. We rent out motel rooms. The lesson learned from the pandemic, I will tell you, in the community, we were trying to take over motel rooms 30 years ago when the problem was much smaller and everybody thought we were crazy. But it took a pandemic for people to realize maybe we can utilize motels. Because of the lessons learned from the pandemic, we now have motel owners coming to us saying, please take over my property. It's a good deal for them. They get guaranteed income for several months. So we put people in motels, and while we are fast forwarding the building, putting people in permanent supportive housing, but addressing their needs from day one. I believe that we have to have the whole of a government approach. We have to have the federal government involved, the state, the county, and the city. In Los Angeles, one of the problems that we had is that the city and the county were pointing fingers at each other. So we joined forces at the beginning of my administration, 5 weeks ago, and the city issued a state of emergency, as I described, and the county issued a state of emergency. So we are working lockstep with each other. We're also working with our state governor, our state government. Our governor is attempting to address the mental health issue through modernizing conservatorship. I happen to believe passionately that it is not okay to watch people die on our streets who are profoundly mentally ill. We know they are mentally ill, and for anybody to think that's freedom, I think that's extremely cruel. Some people need to be hospitalized, they can be stabilized, and then they can be referred back to the community or in supportive housing. And so linking arms with the state government, and then of course being here talking to the federal government. I'm very excited about the Biden administration's plan that's called All In, but here's my concern. If we do not address mental health and substance abuse, I don't care how much housing you build, we will not solve this problem. And I think, thank you. It is important that we learn the lessons from COVID, and so work has changed. A lot of commercial buildings are underutilized, so we need to take those commercial buildings and turn them into mixed-use or affordable housing. A lot of things we learned when we had a public health emergency. We learned what happens when you have a disaster that you're trying to figure your way out. I think we need to use the same point of reference, the same viewpoint to dealing with this problem. I've listened to other speakers talk about the problems in their city, and their populations are much smaller. But let me just leave you with a warning from Los Angeles. Your population of unhoused might not be as massive as 67,000 people, but let me just tell you, if you don't get a handle on it, it will be. This is a solvable problem. We know how to do this, but we have to change our thinking away from the status quo, away from doing things as usual, and view this as a man-made disaster of the 21st century, and we need to all come together, lock arms in our cities, with our local government, county, state, and federal, and turn this situation around. Thank you very much.